All right. So this is the second round of the Ohio Chess Congress. I was white playing in 1980, and my opponent actually beat a master in the first round. So dangerous 1980. And I actually played a new opening. I played e4, and after d6, which I knew my opponent was going to play, I played knight to c3. So the reason I did this is because I wanted to reach a Vienna, because my opponent played e5 here, and that transposes to a Vienna. A Vienna is typically reached after e5 and then knight to c3. And in this position, d6 isn't considered a great move because you're blocking your bishop in. So I kind of wanted to reach this Vienna by a move order transposition. And now this is a better version of a Vienna because my opponent has d6 played. So the idea in the Vienna is you're delaying the development of this knight because you want to leave the option open of moving this f pawn. So having the f pawn move forward can be a very useful thing in general. It can lead to a lot of attacks. So that's kind of why I'm waiting to develop this knight. So in my next few moves, I support this f4 push. Now if black takes, I can just take back with the bishop, and then I go for it. And after after black defends it, now I just play knight to f3 because since I've moved my f pawn now, now it's time to develop that knight, since that was the reason that I was waiting, is to get this move off. So after white castles, now I castle. Both sides are prioritizing developments. Black plays c6, and now I play a4. A4 wasn't the best move, but I was just trying to gain space on the queen side and trying to stop black from playing b5. I also just wanted to give my bishop a square in case it gets attacked, so I can keep it on the board, because this is a very, very nice bishop, aiming towards the center and the king. So I played a4, not the most accurate move. Would have been a little bit better just to take on e5, but I ended up doing that later after black plays a5. I played h3 first. I wanted to control this g4 square, so there's no funny business like with potentially queen b6 check, followed by knight to g4 coming. Now this f2 square is a target. I just wanted to avoid anything like this altogether, and I thought h3 was a useful move because it controls the g4 square. I could play g4 in the future to gain more space on the king side. So black plays queen to c7, and now I feel like it's time to kind of force the issue. So I take on e5. So the reason I took on e5 is because I wanted to improve my pieces, but I wasn't exactly sure how. So I wanted to bring my knight to f5, but if I bring my knight to h4, then potentially a move like g6 would be pretty solid, and it keeps this the square under wraps. And if I ever take on e5, he could take back with a knight, which attacks the bishop, protects f7. So I wanted to take on e5 first, and once I take on e5, they take back. Now and only now do I go knight to h4, because now the knight is heading to f5, and a move like g6 doesn't make as much sense now, because this open f file is going to be very, very strong, and you're weakening the f6 knight. Again, anytime you move a piece, you're weakening a square. So when you move g6, you're weakening this f6 square because it was controlling it, and now after g6, now it's not. So now this knight is heading to f5. I'm just trying to improve my pieces. Another good move would have just been to develop, but I'm trying to be as fast as possible with my attack, and the knight on f5 can be a very strong attacker. So black plays knight c5. I play knight f5, and black takes. So black trades their bishop for my knight. This kind of creates an imbalance in the position, because I spent a few moves getting my knight to the f5 square, and black was able to capture it in one move. But knights are considered to be less valuable than bishops in most positions. So this was a trade I was happy with because I got the bishop pair. I have 2 bishops, and my opponent only has 1 after I recapture on f5. So now my opponent plays rook to d8, centralizing their rook. And I was trying to think of how to improve my pieces. The other thing was right away I noticed that my opponent has the threats of taking on e4. Because if they get to take on e4, well, this d pawn is pinned because the rook just came to the d file, and I can't recapture with my pawn. So I played queen f1. I got my queen out of the way. Queen f3 would have been a good option as well, but I wanted to leave some room for my rook to come back. Then black plays queen d6. With this move, it was pretty clear that black wants to bring this knight to e6, but doesn't want to allow bishop takes e6 and damaging their pawn structure. So they're protecting this e6 square before they bring the knight to e6. And now it's kind of time to bring this bishop into the game. So I play bishop to e3. Black plays knight to e6. Now the knight is potentially heading to one of these squares. And I didn't love that. I wanted to kind of keep black's pieces at bay, so I played knight to e2. Now I'm controlling the square, and that's no longer possible. I also like this move because I could reroute my knight to the king side, potentially back to the f5 square where I had my other knight in the future. So knight e2 is kind of defending and attacking. Black plays knight to d7, and after this move, I played queen to f2, and queen f2 was a mistake. So the reason queen f2 is a mistake is because it's very important for my rook to be able to come back to f2. And we'll see why a little bit later in the game. But I thought my rook would be happy on f3, but that's not exactly the case. So the best move would have been actually to play queen to e1, which looks like a kind of strange move. But the queen's headed to g3, and there's potential ideas of attacking on the dark squares. And I still leave room for my rook to come back to either f3 or f2, or even f1. So I play queen f2, though, a mistake, because black plays g6, and my rook is kind of low on squares. So I go back to f3, and yeah, this is the only square for the rook, so I gotta watch out for that rook being trapped in the future. Black plays king to g7. Now, I didn't love the knight potentially coming to g5, so in this position, I played h4. I just stopped the knight coming to g5 altogether. I think this is a pretty fine move. Computer prefers queen g3 a little bit better, a little bit more. So anyway, h4, f6, and now I kind of lash out. I should have just been more patient with my attack. I should have played rook to f1, increasing the pressure on the f file. I don't have any immediate way to break through with the position, but I do have a lot of pieces pointing towards my opponent's king, so eventually something is bound to open up and prove itself in my favor. So rook to f1, just I need to be more patient, and instead I kind of lashed out. I played h5. Again, not a terrible move, but there's no rush. Black doesn't really have any counterplay. And after h5, my opponent played c5. Now, I was really happy to see this move because I knew it was bad because my opponent only has a dark square bishop, and he put all of his pawns on dark squares. So that kind of limits where this bishop can go and really hinders it. It doesn't have a bright future because all its pawns are blocking it in. So I was very happy to see this move, but I wasn't sure how to combat it. I thought the knight was coming to d4 in the future, which is somewhat true, but it's not anything I really need to worry about because I could play a move like bring the knight to c3. So, for example, say I play rook to f1, knight to d4 isn't anything I need to worry about because I can just take on d4, and after black takes back, I have serious pressure in the position. I can take on g6. I can bring the knight to f4 because this pawn moved. So let's look at this pawn. this seems to make a little bit more sense to me. But in this position, the knight can still come to g3, and from g3, it's still causing a lot of problems for black because there's a lot of potential sacrifices with taking on g6, followed by knight to f5, sacrificing the knight to open up the g and the h file. So very, very strong attack on the horizon. So knight d4 isn't anything I need to worry about because kind of needs the knight to defend, to stay around the king. But I was a little bit too scared. I kind of saw some ghosts, and I played c3, which was not a great move because I stopped a threat that didn't exist. And after c3, knight to g5 happens. I bring the rook to g3. It's only square, and then knight b6. He kicks my bishop. So I go to b5 because I want to be cemented with this pawn, and maybe a move like c4 is possible later. Bishop e3 also would have been fine. And now black takes on h5, and I don't really have a clear way of recapturing. So black kind of stole a free pawn. Normally I would be, pretty happy to give this pawn up, but I have no way of making progress because this rook is trapped. It has nowhere to go, and my knight really, really, really wants to get onto this g3 square, but I can't do that at all with the current situation. So very weird position where my pieces are just stepping over each other, and I can't really make a lot of progress here. So I spent a pretty big think, and I played queen to f5. So my idea with queen to f5 is actually really strange. I wanted to play queen to h3 next, a weird queen maneuver to target this h pawn, and the knight is pinned to the king. So he can't really do anything about it. And once I win the h pawn, then I can move my rook, then I can bring my knight in, and everything is well. So that was my plan. Black plays king h8, so obviously queen h3 is no longer possible. And here, I had to find a really crazy move. I was already a little bit low on time, so it wasn't, um, you know, it's super reasonable to be able to see this move, but I could have and probably should have if I had more time. Saw knight to f4, a really crazy move, sacrificing the knight because this queen is very low on squares. And if the queen goes to e6, I have rook takes g5, removing the defender of the queen. So if he takes back, I can take his queen. And if he takes back here, I can take with my rook, and I'm up a pawn, I believe. No, I'm not up a pawn, but I'm gonna be up a pawn after I take on h5. So knight f4 would have been a really crazy move, and the knight on f4 is just very strong. If you don't take it, it can potentially take on h5 and put pressure on f6. So knight f4 would have been a really strong move. But instead of knight to f4, I played king to f2. Computer gives us a miss because knight to 4 was really the only move that kept my advantage. And after this, my opponent plays queen to e6. And now I no longer have this rook takes g5 trick anymore because after black takes back, my king and queen are pinned. I saw this, but it's just important to note about the position. And in this position, I'm kind of forced to take on e6. And after knight takes e6, I started to get a little freaked out because I didn't like seeing f5. Again, I was kind of low on time. So this position wasn't really going how I wanted. And I played rook f3, which I thought was good. And then I brought the rook to f5. I thought I was just kind of cementing this weakness in the position, and my knight would come to h5, put more pressure, and I thought I would have this bind. And then my opponent played knight to c8, and I kind of realized I have to play for a draw here. like I have no winning chances because if the knight gets to d6, this rook is trapped. So I have to be very careful here. The computer's best move here is actually to play rook to h1 and give up this rook, just sacrifice it. And it's just a very, very weird situation where you can sacrifice this exchange. You get to take here, and apparently white has enough compensation. But I obviously did not see that. So I wanted to keep my rook on the board. So instead of rook h1, I took on g5. Again, mistake by the computer, but I feel like it's pretty reasonable considering the time situation. And after takes, I take on f8. Again, it would have been better to do something a little bit more patient. Knight to g3 was actually slightly more accurate. I did play knight g3 after I took on f8, but this is a better version. What I missed was after h4, I can throw in this check. And although he counter checks, I can block it with knight to f5, just where my knight wants to be. And because it's opposite colored bishops here, this should be a draw. But a similar thing happened in the game after rook takes f8, rook takes f8. My king goes to e3, and now, my king is just very similar to the game, but my king is in a worse spot. And if my opponent plays h4, now I can no longer get this knight to f5, which is where it really wants to be. So anyway, after rook takes f8, king e3, my opponent played g4 pretty quickly, and I was very happy to see this because now I can get this knight to the f5 square, which is, again, exactly where it wants to be. And because it's so strong, because it plugs the f file, black pretty much has to trade his knight for my knight. And then we reach a position where it's opposite colored bishops. Whenever it's opposite colored bishops, it's very close to being a draw. So the last thing I do is I kind of tickle that pawn. And here, if my opponent plays h5, the game continues. He still has some winning chances, although this should be a draw, if I don't do anything crazy. But, there's definitely ways I could mess it up. And instead, he just plays g3, which just draws the game on the spot. Because now, after rook f1, and we trade rooks, there's just no way for either side to make progress. We actually played a few more moves, but I didn't bother putting them in or showing them because uh, they didn't really mean anything. So the game is just a draw here because neither side can make progress. I could just put my king on f3, my bishop on h3, and put my pawn here, just put everything on a light square, and there's no way for, again, either side to make progress. So even though black has an extra pawn, it doesn't mean anything because he can't use it. Because there's no way you can push a pawn without losing more material from black side. So this was my second round game. It was a draw, but some of my takeaways from that game were, again, to be more patient when I'm attacking and putting pressure on my opponents. We saw that pattern in my first game as well, so it's definitely something I need to work on. But that was really the big one. The other thing was just to not be scared of Ghost, especially when he played c5. And I thought the knight coming to d4 would be really scary. It really wasn't. It didn't really do much. So it wasn't something I needed to worry about so much. So being more patient and not being scared of ghosts, kind of my takeaways from that game. And I'll see you in the next one, which was a really exciting game.